Hello and welcome to The Edge. We'll take an in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We're bringing not just the facts, but also deep insights into the topics with expert opinions and social media reactions. Let's make a start with our look beyond the edge. There's been a unilateral ceasefire after rebel forces in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region have retaken its capital, Mekelle. However, the fighting has left thousands dead and has pushed 350,000 towards famine. What has Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's response been to the events unfolding in the Tigray region? A recent study has found that a mix and match approach to COVID vaccines using different brands for first and second doses appears to give good protection against the pandemic virus. Experts say that this knowledge could offer flexibility for vaccine rollouts. And health experts are concerned about the easing of COVID-19 restrictions by nations hosting Euro 2020 matches, noting that some are already seeing rising cases. The Euro 2020 tournament is being held around the continent. The final 3 matches will all be at Wembley Stadium in England. How safe is it for fans to go to stadiums? And those are the top 3 stories that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. The conflict in Ethiopia between the country's defence force and the Tigray People's Liberation Front has left hundreds of thousands of people displaced and thousands more dead. But how did the conflict start? Let's find out in our infographic. On Monday, the Ethiopian government declared a unilateral ceasefire with immediate effect in a bid to end the conflict which has dominated the Tigray region since November last year.
After months of fighting in a deadly civil war, the former governing party in Ethiopia's Tigray region said on Monday it was back in control of the regional capital, Mekelle, after Ethiopian military forces retreated from the city. The Ethiopian government, which ousted Tigray's leadership late last year, declared a ceasefire with immediate effect. Residents in downtown Mekelle reported seeing rebel troops in the city for the first time since they were driven out by Ethiopian forces in November, and several witnesses described celebration in the streets. A spokesperson for the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, told Reuters by phone that the capital of Tigray, Mekelle, is under their control. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he had spoken with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and was, quote, hopeful that an effective cessation of hostilities will take place. Monday's developments followed recent reports of an escalation in fighting between Ethiopian troops and the TPLF outside Mekelle. Last Tuesday, an airstrike killed over 60 people in a town northwest of Mekelle, a medical official told Reuters. An Ethiopian military spokesperson said last week that only combatants, not civilians, had been hit. The attack was one of the deadliest reported incidents in months in the region.
And I'm joined live from Minneapolis in Minnesota by Edao Dewano, who's an Ethiopian activist. Edao, thank you for joining us again here today on The Edge.
Thank you for having me.
Now, there's been a major, many would say positive development in the last 24 hours or so, that a ceasefire has been called between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray region. Can you explain to us what exactly this means?
Well, what it means is that this clearly shows the gravity of the humanitarian crisis in the region. And as the conflict arises and the humanitarian situation was pretty much a dire issue, and to avoid further great instability and disaster, ceasing fire was, I think, the best option for both groups. However, the call has been made so far by the Tigray provisional regional government, that's the pretty much controlling Tigray, that's requested for the federal government to cease fire at this point to avert against all the possible humanitarian disaster that might unfold. So it is based on that merit that the federal government is considering to cease fire at this point. In addition to that, it's not only the call of the regional authority that was put in place, but the international community also have been requesting and pleading that the conflict stops. So ceasing fire was not only the best outcome, but it is the necessary due to the fact that currently it is the farming season. So the farmers must step up and farm, and they have to till land. And as you know, that the greater crisis is just pretty much the food shortage. In order to tackle that, the farmers got to farm, and farmers to farm, the conflict must stop. And based on these merits, pretty much the regional authority that was put in place plead for ceasefires. And I believe this is a good step toward choosing life instead of absolute disastrous situation in the area. So it is based on merits. Pretty much at this point, the government have taken the step forward.
Well, this is obviously a very noble step to take because, as you say, life is too valuable, and conflict is never a good thing. But the conflict started back in November. The Tigrayan government under Abiy Ahmed initiated the strikes, should I say, into Tigray. So, what's the rationale between then and now? If military action was required, so the Ethiopian government thought in November, is it just for humanitarian reasons that they're withdrawing now, or is this the signs of some political solution to come?
The ceasing fire is pretty much to be able the humanitarian aid to take effect for people to farm. However, the conflict that was started then, the discourse pretty much is a rule of law enforcement engagement that has taken place so far, and that will continue to pursue. However, at this point, ceasefire, it is very, very crucial for the humanitarian assistance to be delivered and for these people to be rescued at this point. This does not necessarily mean a solution. However, it is a step forward to finding a means of pretty much calming the situation down and to allow Tigrayans to breathe and to save life and rethink the whole engagement and go forward. So it is within this merits that all these events are unfolding right now.
And the experiences of the last 8 months have obviously been horrific for many people. I think the number of displaced is something like 2 million, and the number the number on the edge of famine is in the hundreds of thousands. So, how will the government be working to bring humanitarian aid in? How will they help to resolve this tragic circumstance?
Well, the government has been providing assistance ever since the displacement took place, ever since there was the need for food or other humanitarian needs were an issue. The government has been doing its part. But right now it is taking different tone because the conflict is kind of evolving to pretty much the TPLF that once left power, after they all fought, they turned out to be more of a insurgency group that has been recruiting civilians, citizens. So this is citizens are the ones that are engaging in this conflict, and this is allowing the Tigrayans to suffer even further. So what happened right now is that a civilian will engage in a war, an act of war, and they will shoot and kill and create destruction. So what happened is that when they are killed, they are called civilians. However, all the civilians are nothing but a military force that the TPLF remnant have regrouped to utilize and exploit the population. So for this point right now, the government was going after those guys that were pretty much that initiated the war. Now, this innocent has become a victim because they'll be brainwashed. There's propaganda being so much disseminated throughout the Tigray regions that is the front face of the war or the conflict are now the citizens. It is for this reason that ceasing a fire it is very, very crucial, because the people that are being pushed, the people that are sent to engage in a conflict are the innocent lives right now. So it is the insurgency that is turning to exploit its own population to gain some sort of a victory. However, what they're bringing is they're calling for a greater disaster that beyond one can imagine in the region. So it is a wiser step for the government to stop this and rethink and then find a humanitarian possible means of rescuing these people from a greater disaster, because a war can go on, the government can remain in position and fight, but however, they will be exposing the innocents' lives to greater danger. For these reasonings, ceasing fire, it is absolute state, possible absolute state moving forward. And it is also the call of many international leaderships, either the US, the EU, or the United Nations Secretary General has been calling for such kind of pretty much action to be taken. And I think the government has taken such a noble step forward, and this will probably, will eventually turn to more of a positive step.
I hear what you say about the involvement of civilians in Tigray, but at the same time there have been reports over the last 8 months of some horrific acts by soldiers, particularly from Eritrean soldiers, and in the last few days Ethiopian soldiers have also been accused of invading the United Nations, the UNICEF headquarters in Mekelle, for example, and many other examples. Will the government be investigating these claims and seeking recourse for them?
I think they will do like any other country or pretty much a military force. They have their own courts of engagement, rule of law that they follow. They have their own military courts in which they will investigate and bring those that committed a crime of any kind to face justice, because this is the government. It is not an insurgency group that is outlawed, that behave in very abnormal ways. I believe that the government will go ahead and then investigate and then do what needs to be done according to international law and also their domestic laws.
And finally, let me ask you, we've already spoken previously about the wide diversity of ethnic groupings in Ethiopia, which totally complicates the domestic politics for the country. It seems as though some sort of military solution is not a practical way forwards. Is there any hope that through diplomacy between the tribes, between the different groups, that the peace can be brought back to the whole of Ethiopia and all the Ethiopian people there of whatever ethnicity?
Absolutely. Like I said earlier, initially the whole discourse was pretty much the rule of law operation performance that was launched initially. It is to go after those that are committing the crime, after those that attack the military command at the north. It was never meant to be a war of civil engagement of any sort. Therefore, war would not be an answer. Right now, we are in post-election, and I'm sure that the government will find a way to sit down with this group of people or whatnot, and then pave a platform in which dialogue can take place. Because a war would not solve a problem, and so does the election. The people need to come to the table. People, or all kind of group of people, either political or civic, must come on the table and discuss and pave what's the best way for Ethiopians as whole. Because a country can only perform at its best when everybody is on the same page and have the same unity and the same aspiration. Ethiopia will not prosper without leaving Tigray region behind. Tigray is part of Ethiopian government's jurisdiction, so they need to be coming to a table. I think that will happen eventually. At this point, I mean, there's a lot of emotion involved. There is aspirations to go and attack farther, even though the government have choose to cease fire. But eventually, I hope that there's a wise man among both groups that will come to their common sense to say, you know what, let's sit down, let's talk, because war will not bring absolute desire. Pretty much the best outcome that's needed for the population to live in harmony and go forward. So that will happen eventually.
Well, we hope that best outcome is reached sooner rather than later. Eduardo, thank you so much for joining us again here today on The Edge. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Earlier this month, the United Nations described a situation of famine in northern Ethiopia. It said that the food situation had reached the level of catastrophe, which it defines as starvation and death affecting small groups of people spread over large areas. United Nations World Food Programme and UNICEF have called for urgent action. We hope that this recent ceasefire will improve the humanitarian situation in the region. For now, let's move on to our next topic to discuss a recent study which has findings about vaccines, which could have a big importance in fighting variants. The World Health Organization has announced a new naming system for variants of COVID-19. Our following infographic gives an overview of the spread of variants. An Oxford study has found that mixing and matching the coronavirus vaccines made by Pfizer-BioNTech and AstraZeneca Oxford generates a robust immune response against the virus.
An Oxford study said on Monday that a mixed schedule of vaccines, where a shot of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine is given 4 weeks after an AstraZeneca shot, will produce better immune responses than giving another dose of AstraZeneca. The study, called COMCOV, compared mixed two-dose schedules of Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines and found that in any combination they produced high concentrations of antibodies against the coronavirus spike protein.
So we were looking at mixed and match combinations of the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines in our study, and we found that actually there are multiple options when using these vaccines, that you're not locked into using the same vaccine at the first and second dose.
The data provides support for the decision of some European countries that have started offering alternatives to AstraZeneca as a second shot after the vaccine was linked to rare blood clots. Matthew Snape, the Oxford professor behind the trial, said that the findings could be used to give flexibility to vaccine rollouts, but it was not large enough to recommend a broader shift away from clinically approved schedules on its own. The highest antibody response was seen in people receiving 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, with both mixed schedules producing better responses than 2 doses of AstraZeneca. An AstraZeneca shot followed by Pfizer produced the best T-cell responses, and also a higher antibody response than Pfizer followed by AstraZeneca.
I think these mix and match type studies are really important when it comes to thinking about how these vaccines are going to be used globally. And other studies are looking at other vaccines, including the Chinese vaccines and the Sputnik V vaccines, because these are the vaccines that might be used more in low and middle income countries.
The results were for combinations of vaccines given at 4-week intervals to 830 participants. Comcov is also looking at mixed schedules for over 12-week intervals, and Snape noted that AstraZeneca's shot was known to produce better immune responses with a longer interval between doses.
I'm now joined live from Bath in England by Dr. Bharat Pankhania, who's a senior clinical lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. Dr. Pankhania, thank you for joining us again today. Today, the Wimbledon tennis match started in England, tournament started, and it started with applause for the Professor Sarah Gilbert, for one of the scientists that discovered the AstraZeneca virus. And so it's appropriate today that we should be talking about some good news about a study involving AstraZeneca after the previous conversations we've had to have about problems which had come up. Can you tell us about this concept of mixing and matching vaccines? What does that mean?
So it's, of course, good news, and we've known about that it would be better to mix, and it is really nice to have it confirmed that it works, and it works better. So for our viewers and listeners, let me explain. The AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine is made using a adenovirus, that's a sort of common cold type virus, but obtained from primates, in other words, chimpanzees, that sort of thing. So the reason we go to the primate route is in case we have met it before. So the primate one, we will highly unlikely to have met that virus before, and therefore we won't have antibodies against it. And then we take that virus and ask it to make mRNA, and then that mRNA makes the proteins, and it makes the immunity. So that's how the AstraZeneca one works. But if you were to repeatedly give that AstraZeneca vaccine, you may make antibodies against the virus that is carrying the message. So if you were to have the AstraZeneca one first, and then the Pfizer one to follow, you will have an immunity from different platforms. One is via the viral route, the other is via the nanoparticles that bring in the mRNA. And that, of course, it shows it works better.
And could you clarify for those who haven't yet picked up on what the significance of the mRNA are? Because this is a new technology in vaccines that I think we've seen for the first time in use now, and very exciting for the future of treatments.
Yes, it's very exciting, and it's really good news for humanity, because I bet you we will use many of these platforms for other things. So the mRNA is a very, very simple compound, and it is a code, and it only does one thing. It makes the spike protein. So the instructions in the little strand of messenger RNA are the instructions, and the instructions are to the ribosome, which is a little organ inside the cell, to make the spike protein. That is all it does. It doesn't interfere with your nucleus. It doesn't interfere with your DNA. The AstraZeneca vaccine is slightly different in that it gives the to your DNA to make the mRNA to make the spike protein. But apart from that, it's the same. So for our viewers and listeners, the mRNA is just a code, a small code, which instructs either your ribosome or your nucleus to make spike protein. And then our body recognizes the spike protein as alien, not wanted. Immune memory against it. And that's how the vaccines work.
Very interesting. Now, one thing I'm reading is that all the combinations prime the immune system. But this priming of the immune system, does that give us protection against other viruses, or is it specifically just against COVID-19?
Oh, it is very specific. It is very specific against SARS-CoV-2. Having said that, as we know, we get mutations and little variations and variants arising. But the immunity is such that it will cover those spike proteins which change a little bit, but they don't significantly change. Therefore, the immunity is against SARS-CoV-2, and so far, so good. It is effective against all the variants that we've had so far. Of course, the effectiveness is a little bit reduced, but it still works. And going forward, when we find a variant that is really dominant and really stable, we will reformulate the vaccines to cover the dominant variant that is circulating at that point in time. And that's not a difficult task. We just have to recode the mRNA to code for the new variant type of spike protein, slightly changed in shape. That's all. It's very good technology and it works.
So is this study helping us to see forward into the future as to whether or not we might need a booster for against coronavirus?
Well, the study says the mixture works better. It doesn't necessarily answer the question about we need a booster. To answer that question will be to see how well the immunity is lasting beyond a year, for example. But I'm already very confident that immunity lasts beyond a year anyway, because we've seen it through natural infection. So that will be by testing people who have been immunized and see if they remain protected beyond a year. And I think they will be.
And I imagine that following this study, that further studies will need to be conducted to see which combinations of drugs will work together, and whether the new treatments which we discussed last week that are coming online are other tools to add into the box to help with the treatment of the pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. But, you know, empirically, I knew that it would work, and it is really good to see it confirmed by a proper study. So I wouldn't be dwelling too much on which one is the best combination. My urgency is to get the vaccines in any combination as fast as possible to as many people as possible. That's the urgency. But the really good news is this. I expect we will be able to make better quality vaccines against other infections that so far we have not succeeded in doing. So I'm thinking about malaria, dengue fever, chikungunya, and even ordinary other infections for which the antibiotics are now not working. So I remain very positive on the vaccines front against several diseases, the exotic tropical ones, as well as the ones where the antibiotics have stopped working.
Well, I'm glad you just brought that up, because I was wanting to ask you, you've dedicated many years of your life, decades maybe, to communicable disease control and infectious disease management. So this pandemic, what has the course of this pandemic and the things that we've learned and developed, especially to deal with it, what has that meant for the progress of the field that you've been dedicating your life to?
We've come into the spotlight. So we are always backroom boys, and nobody really heard about us. Even my father would say, that's not what a real doctor does. So, you know, all the work that we've been doing with regard to prevention, protection, blue sky thinking, planning for the inevitable, planning for the unthought of, all of those things have happened. And with regard to the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, all of these things we would have thought of, we did consider, and most people would have discarded it as, you're only dreaming, this is all theoretical stuff. And it has come to pass that all those things we thought of have actually happened.
So, so does this give you hope that in the future, I know you've looked at many other outbreaks, for example, Ebola and so on and so forth. Does this give you hope that when some other outbreak of some other virus or whatever comes along, the world is now, I can't say immunized because that's the wrong word, is now ready to be triggered to deal with that in a much more proactive way than it maybe did for the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think so, because it has given a wake-up call to politicians, the purse holders, the money holders, because they've suddenly realized our importance. And I hope that they will invest in places like the Centers for Disease Control America, Public Health England, UK, ECDC in Europe, European Centers for Disease Control, and the World Health Organization, because we need the funding, we need that continuous new training of new people, etc. And the big wake-up call is for the politicians. We've always known that these things would happen, but most politicians are only there for 5 years and a 5-year cycle, so they have not invested as much as they should have in prevention, because prevention is a lot cheaper than fighting the pandemic, whereas we both see we've spent trillions upon trillions of pounds fighting the pandemic, when actually we should have invested in prevention.
Absolutely, and that's the prevention. Sadly, doesn't if you do your job effectively, you don't see the results because there's nothing to fight. But we know it's better to have a system to put out the fire before the building burns down. But that wasn't to happen. So we've just got we're talking about the vaccines and how maybe a mix and match approach might come along, but how important is people not to take their eye off the ball and to get their vaccinations done and to take their personal responsibility still towards COVID-19?
So it's very important, and the vaccines will save your lives. The hurtful, the painful bit is that the rich nations have the vaccines and the poor nations do not have any vaccines, and therefore they've got nothing. So I hope that vaccine manufacture will be enabled so that more people can be immunized and lives saved, and that's what we need to do.
Yeah, and quite right. We were just talking the other day about how Africa is still in only 1 or 2% of people have been vaccinated. Haiti, I believe, nobody yet has received a vaccination. This is a terrible state of affairs, and we must put that right. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Dr. Bharat Pankhania, thank you so much for joining us today here on The Edge. Thank you. The initial results of this mix and match vaccine trial are highly encouraging and throw up some interesting options for booster doses. But it's also worth noting that mixing vaccines does produce more short-term side effects, such as chills, headaches and muscle pain. We hope that people all around the globe can get their vaccine because, as we just heard, and as other experts also said, the pandemic can only be defeated if the whole world's population is immunised. For now, let's move on to our final topic to speak about the concerns of health experts as the Euro 2020 finals will be held with spectators. Health experts are concerned about the easing of COVID-19 restrictions by nations hosting Euro 2020 matches, noting that some are already seeing rising cases. But what measures has UEFA taken? Our infographic explains. Ahead of the Euro 2020 semi-finals and finals set to be held in London's Wembley Stadium, EU officials have expressed concerns over the rapid spread of the Delta variant.
EU officials expressed concern on Monday over the rapid spread of the highly infectious Delta variant, first discovered in India. European Commission Vice President Margarita Schinas said during a meeting of the European Parliament Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety that the scientific advice they were getting from the ECDC was not good. He said the ECDC modelling scenarios suggested that further relaxations of coronavirus restrictions would lead to a significant increase in daily cases in all age groups, with an associated increase in hospitalizations and probable deaths. Furthermore, he had doubts about London's Wembley Stadium hosting the semi-final and final match of the European Soccer Championship at high capacity.
J'aimerais partager avec vous mes doutes sur la possibilité d'organiser la finale, la demi-finale à Wembley dans un stade comble au moment où le Royaume-Uni eux-mêmes limitent les déplacements de leurs citoyens vers l'Union européenne. Alors, il faut avoir une certaine symétrie entre ce type de décision et une certaine proportionnalité. Et je pense que l'UEFA fera bien à analyser avec soin ces décisions.
The UK government had said Wembley would be allowed to hold the Euro 2020 semi-finals and final with at least 60,000 fans.
And I'm joined from London in England by Ben Jacobs, who's a sports journalist. Ben, thank you for joining us again here today on A News. When we last spoke, Euro 2020 had just begun, and now we're about halfway through.
Yes, halfway through, and as we speak, England have just taken the lead against Germany, so you'll forgive me for starting with a smile.
Well, that's a good one. Our producer is German, so we'll and I'm British, so what can we do? We'll have to hope for a good result, a friendly result. But, Ben, the Euro 2020 has been going full pace for a fortnight or so already, and now not wanting to take their eye off the ball, so to speak, they're now looking ahead towards the final matches, which will be held at Wembley. And there are some concerns about the crowd capacity at the stadiums. Well, what can you tell us about that?
Well, as you've alluded to, numbers are rising, particularly of the Delta variant in the United Kingdom, and the semi-final and final of Euro 2020, as it's still called, even though it's a year later, are both at Wembley Stadium. So UEFA's concern is twofold. Number one, should the semi-finals and finals stay at Wembley Stadium? And then number two, which is equally as important, if it stays at Wembley Stadium, and the games will almost certainly, what should the capacity be? And what we're seeing is numbers inside Wembley Stadium incrementally rising per round until eventually, when we get to the final, Wembley may well be at full capacity. And that's of concern to those in the medical profession, when the consideration alongside the numbers increasing is juxtaposed against the fact that that Delta variant of COVID-19 is rising. And generally, this has been a problem across the whole tournament for health authorities, because this isn't a COVID-friendly tournament on paper for the players. And in fairness, the logistics around what the UEFA guidance purports is very strong, and we haven't had a known outbreak because of a football match yet, but of course it can take weeks before we actually see potential damage done from large-scale events. But all of the guidance around the match and the protection of the players is very strong, but naturally, if cases go up and attendances go up, medical professionals are going to advise that that's not necessarily the best course of action. So I think that the actual organisers within each country are still relatively happy with how the tournament has gone so far, because, as I say, we haven't had too many mass outbreaks. We did, of course, have one Scotland player, Billy Gilmore, test positive for COVID shortly after England against Scotland and that 0-0 draw. But generally speaking, the tournament hasn't had any kind of COVID problems. And that's why maybe some medical professionals are saying, why take the risk? Why increase the numbers? But remember, as far as Wembley Stadium is concerned, there's been plenty of government test events, including the FA Cup semi-final and final. And I think that's why we've seen an increase in numbers, because this isn't just a decision based on sentiment or based upon the fact that the numbers are aspiring to be bigger around the final. This is a much more structured plan and process that started with small-scale testing events and will eventually lead to a full capacity. And hopefully, as a consequence, with the right guidance, even though there are concerns, we won't see any mass outbreaks.
Well, of course, the British government would be the last to want to see an outbreak happening being attributable to events at the United Kingdom. And this also raises questions about other events. For instance, Wimbledon is looking to have, which has started yesterday, is looking forward to having large crowd capacities. And also the big question mark over this summer's Olympic Games.
Yes, and that might be the knock-on effect. All it could potentially take is one outbreak in one country, even disconnected from another country and another sporting event. And suddenly, as we saw when COVID first happened about a year ago or so, a lot of sporting events kind of fell in a dominoes effect, even though different countries had different circumstances and different numbers. So the Olympics probably now isn't in doubt because we're so close to the event, but we are definitely seeing a tightening of restrictions as far as spectators and friends and family coming in, and a few athletes are naturally very uncomfortable as well. So what we're kind of going to see is not just less tourism around a sporting event, but probably a lower performance rate as well. And I think that will be more apparent in the Olympics than this Euros, because the Euros is obviously a team sport. And as we saw even last night with two sensational games, the quality of football has been high and very dramatic as well. And that's continued into this England-Germany game as I speak. And your German producer won't like this. Thomas Müller went clean through for Germany and failed to equalise. And that's the kind of drama that we've seen all tournament long, either wonder goals or high-scoring games or incredible saves, and in this case Germany have missed an absolute sitter, and England might go through in a kind of historic fixture between two rivals. So the sporting side of things has definitely given people something to cheer about, get excited about, and unite a culture. But we need to make sure that that's not at the expense of athlete health and safety and fan health and safety. And the one advantage of England compared to perhaps places like Tokyo in the Olympics or other venues in Europe is simply the fact that the vaccination rate is also very high in England. So the number of cases is concerning, but it's also to be predicted when people start coming out and about and restrictions end up easing. And by July the 19th in the United Kingdom, all of the restrictions will have been lifted unless the course needs to change. But of course, if you get a load of people with COVID, but you have a very low percentage of those with serious cases, hospitalizations and deaths, then ultimately it becomes a disease that we can live with. And sports events will not want to be the catalyst for how we live with it. In other words, they won't want to gather mass crowds and say, if you get it, you get it, because it's now a lot safer to get it, because that is still irresponsible. But ultimately, it's definitely an advantage for Wembley Stadium, even with rising numbers, the fact that that vaccination rate is very high. And another thing, just to add briefly, is I think as we get closer to the final in particular, much like with the Champions League, a lot will also depend on who's in that final, because if hypothetically it's England, then I would say there is a 0% chance of the final being moved. And that's not because England just want to play in their home stadium. It's because the fans travelling in, 50% of them anyway, won't have to get on a plane, won't risk bringing something in the country or out of the country, and won't have isolation.
So that's another good reason for cheering England on today, so they get through. Ben, thanks so much for joining us. We've run out of time. Pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The new levels mean that the stadium will be at 75% capacity for the final three games, which conclude with the final on the 11th of July. All ticket holders will need to have either a negative COVID-19 test or proof of full vaccination, 2 doses received 14 days before the fixture. We hope that all fans will enjoy the matches without any problems. So our analysts from around the world have provided their insights on today's top stories. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. And before closing our programme, let's take a look at social media to hear your voices and reactions on today's top story shared with the hashtag Tigray. And here's what you've been saying on Twitter about Tigray. Abiod Belai said, I see euphoria from the TPLF side. I see dismay from the other side. But a ceasefire is called and necessary. We also don't know the circumstances and pushing factors for the decision. And Tad says, the fall of Mekelle under TDF and the unilateral ceasefire didn't end the humanitarian crisis in Tigray. Still needed aid is stored out of Tigray and blocked by Ethiopian and partner forces. Unfettered access and reaching out to the need is a priority now. And Antonio Malatu says, from the very beginning, war wasn't a solution, and it won't be too late to make a peace deal, though the war costs lives of thousands. Both parties should put their guns down and talk for the sake of their people. And let's now take a look at our video of the day, which calls on the international community not to forget Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah. And that's all for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boyns. Stay tuned as we'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.